Hello, welcome to our presentation on the gender wage gap. We'll be going over our team that put together this analysis, the problem statement, our approach, stakeholders, key findings, and then finally recommendations. So kicking it off with the team, we have Nikki, Stephanie, Dioanne, and myself, Andrea. And the problem that we're trying to solve is that women are still being affected across the world by the gender wage gap. Even though we're seeing a slight decrease in the median gender wage gap, this is still an issue. And so let's dive into the approach we took for this analysis. We know that the gender wage gap is well studied, and one of the factors that we wanted to really dig into was the female representation in companies and countries. So our hypothesis is how does female representation higher up affect the wage gap, and how does it compare across countries?
The stakeholders here are companies. The reason why companies should care about the wage gap is that with an increased wage gap, this gives rise to unhappy employees, which causes poor productivity. This then leads to companies not being able to retain their employees, and then the companies will need to train new hires, which ultimately costs them money.
Finding number 1, female seats on the board versus the wage gap, we looked to see whether or not there was any association between the gender wage gap and the female share of board seats of the largest publicly listed companies among all the countries included in our data set. What we found was strong positive correlation between female board representation and a decrease in the gender wage gap. From this information, we can expect to see a significant decline in the gender wage gap with an increase in the number of women in board-level leadership positions. We also looked at the association between the share of female managers and the gender wage gap. We found that there was, in fact, slight positive correlation between female management and a decrease in the gender wage gap, although not as significant as the correlation between female board representation and the gender wage gap. From this information, the wage gap should decline with an increase in female management.
Now, let's look at how the wage gap differs in our sample by country's GDP per capita. We've divided our sample of 40 countries into quadrants. We'll specifically look at seats on the board as we have found that has more of a correlation. Over time, female representation on the board of major companies has been growing worldwide. However, the bottom quartile lags behind. How is this affecting the wage gap? We can see the wage gap steadily decreasing as we move up in GDP quartile, with the exception of the third quartile. Female representation has increased in the third quartile, but the wage gap has only dropped by 4 points. This differs from other quartiles. Let's take a closer look at the countries making up this quartile. When we zoom in on the countries, we find 2 drive the higher wage gap and lower seats on the board. South Korea and Japan both show much lower board seats and higher wage gap. We can see as we look across these countries over time, the wage gap has dropped as board representation increases. This leads us to conclude that even in countries where the wage gap remains high, female board representation is positively correlated with a reduction in the wage gap.
The takeaways and recommendations slide. Takeaways from our study shows that 1, the wage gap should decline with an increase in the number of women on the board in big companies. 2, the wage gap should slightly decline with an increase in the number of women in management. And 3, GDP has an impact on female representation and therefore the gender wage gap. Some of the main recommendations we have for companies is to commit to gender balance in leadership and the broader workforce, support mothers and families, and provide development and network building opportunities for women.